October 1962. The world stood on the edge of destruction. Streets were filled with people listening anxiously to their radios, schools practiced nuclear drills, and leaders on both sides of the globe sat in tense war rooms, their hands hovering over buttons that could annihilate millions in seconds. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest humanity has ever come to nuclear war. The tension did not build overnight. This was the Cold War, an era defined by mistrust, espionage, and the terrifying race for nuclear superiority between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. After World War II, both nations had emerged as ideological rivals, one championing capitalism and democracy, the other communism and state control. Each was determined to prevent the other from gaining too much power, and so began a dangerous game where nuclear weapons were not just a tool of war, but a tool of negotiation, intimidation, and control. But this game had a twist. It wasn't just about who had more nuclear weapons, it was about who would blink first. The United States had long held an advantage by placing nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, capable of striking Moscow in mere minutes. The Soviet Union, under Nikita Khrushchev, knew that if war ever broke out, the first strike would likely come from the Americans, but then came an opportunity: Cuba. Only 90 miles from the US coastline, Cuba had just undergone a communist revolution led by Fidel Castro. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, where the US attempted and failed to overthrow Castro, convinced him that America would never let him rule peacefully. Seeking protection, Cuba turned to the Soviet Union. Khrushchev saw this as the perfect countermove. If the US had nuclear missiles in Turkey, why shouldn't the USSR place nuclear missiles in Cuba? And so, in the dead of night, Soviet ships secretly sailed across the Atlantic, carrying nuclear warheads, military personnel, and missile infrastructure to Cuba. It was the most dangerous gambit of the Cold War. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and captured photographic evidence that sent shockwaves through Washington. Nuclear missiles, Soviet nuclear missiles, were being assembled on Cuban soil. These missiles weren't just theoretical threats, they had the range to strike Washington, D.C., New York, and most of the U.S. mainland within minutes. President John F. Kennedy now had a choice, but neither option was safe. If the United States launched an attack on Cuba, it could trigger a Soviet retaliation. If the United States did nothing, they would look weak, emboldening Khrushchev to make even more aggressive moves. This was a classic example of game theory's prisoner's dilemma. Both sides had everything to lose, but neither could afford to back down first. Kennedy and his advisors debated fiercely. Some military generals urged an immediate airstrike followed by an invasion of Cuba. Others, aware of the potential consequences, argued for diplomacy. A single miscalculation could set off a nuclear war. Kennedy made his move. On October 22, 1962, he appeared on national television and announced that the United States would be placing a naval blockade around Cuba. No more Soviet ships would be allowed to bring in weapons, and any missile attack from Cuba would be seen as an act of war from the USSR, triggering a full-scale retaliation. The world waited. As American warships formed a blockade around Cuba, Soviet cargo ships carrying more missiles continued to sail toward them. If they refused to turn back, the US would be forced to fire. If the US fired, the USSR would respond. If that happened, nuclear war would be inevitable. This was the ultimate example of brinkmanship, a game theory concept where two opponents push each other to the very edge, daring the other to back down first. Imagine two cars speeding towards each other in a game of chicken. If one driver swerves, they lose. But if neither swerves, both are destroyed. For days, Soviet and American forces stood at a terrifying standstill. US bombers armed with nuclear warheads were ready to strike within minutes. Soviet submarines lurked beneath the ocean's surface, prepared to respond. The world was closer to war than ever before. Then the first Soviet ship stopped. Slowly the others turned back. But the crisis was far from over. Behind closed doors, Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged secret messages. The Soviets offered a deal. They would remove their missiles from Cuba, but only if the United States publicly agreed never to invade Cuba. Kennedy agreed. But there was one more part of the deal, one that the world wouldn't know about for decades. In a secret, unannounced agreement, Kennedy also agreed to remove American nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy. The US could not afford to look like they were giving in, so this part of the deal was never made public at the time. And just like that, the most dangerous standoff in history was over. When the crisis ended, both sides claimed victory. The USA had successfully forced the USSR to remove its missiles from Cuba, but the Soviets had also achieved their objective, securing Cuba from future American invasions and quietly eliminating American missiles from Turkey. However, the consequences were deeper than just geopolitics. Khrushchev's reputation took a hit within the Soviet Union, and 2 years later, he was removed from power. In contrast, Kennedy emerged stronger, proving himself as a leader who had averted nuclear war through diplomacy. Most importantly, both nations learned an unforgettable lesson. A war between nuclear superpowers was not an option. To prevent such a crisis from happening again, the Moscow-Washington hotline was established, a direct phone line between the White House and the Kremlin. This way, leaders could communicate instantly instead of risking misinterpretations that could lead to war. New treaties were signed, limiting nuclear testing and reducing the risk of accidental escalation. But the Cuban Missile Crisis left one chilling reality. The world had come within inches of complete destruction, and next time we might not be so lucky. The Cuban Missile Crisis may have ended peacefully, but the game of nuclear brinkmanship never truly disappeared. Today, tensions between the US and countries like Russia, China and North Korea, including Iran versus Israel, raise similar fears. With nuclear weapons still in the hands of multiple nations, could we face another standoff like 1962?